This happened when I was just out of college, and I moved into my first apartment on my own. I had been living with my parents up until then, but when my younger brother moved out for college, they decided to downsize. It was expected that I would get my own place at that point, which is fair. I was working a part-time job at a hardware store, and was taking night classes at the community college, so my budget was tight. That's why I had to settle for a crappy apartment in a sketchy area. It was in the basement of an older building, and it had a weird feel. The walls were solid blocks of stone, and it was cold. The floor was concrete, and it felt like a dungeon. That being said, I did have a lot of space. There were 2 bedrooms, even though it was cheaper than any 1-bedroom apartment that I could find. The place came unfurnished, so to save money, I started buying things secondhand on Craigslist. At first it was great. I found a used couch for $40, a coffee table for $15, and a decent desk for free if I could pick it up. Most of the sellers were friendly enough. They were older folks downsizing, or people just looking to get rid of extra stuff. I started to get comfortable with the routine of messaging people, arranging meetups, and hauling things back to my apartment. One day, I came across an ad for a TV stand. It was a simple wooden thing with shelves. Nothing fancy, but it was listed for just $10. The post didn't have much detail, just a blurry photo, a short description, and a phone number. I texted the seller, and they replied almost immediately, saying it was still available, and that I could come by that evening to pick it up. The address they gave me was about 20 minutes away, in a neighborhood I didn't know well. I figured it was fine. It wasn't the first time I'd driven somewhere unfamiliar for a Craigslist deal. I arrived just after 7 p.m. The house was a small single-story place with a small front yard and a chain-link fence around it. The driveway was empty, and the curtains on the windows were drawn. It looked like no one was home, but the seller had texted me earlier, confirming I could come by. I parked on the street and walked up to the door with the money in my pocket. I knocked, and after a few moments, the door opened just a crack. A man peeked out, only showing half his face. He looked older, maybe in his 50s, with long messy hair and a worn-out t-shirt.
"You here for the stand?"
he asked. His voice was barely above a whisper, and he didn't smile. "Yeah," I said, trying to sound casual.
"Come in, it's in the back,"
he said, opening the door wider. I was a little nervous. Normally, people would bring the item out to the porch or the driveway. Going inside wasn't something I usually did, but I didn't want to seem rude. Against my better judgment, I stepped inside. The house smelled faintly of cigarettes and something else I couldn't place. The living room was dark, and it was a mess, with dirty dishes and clothes all over the place. He led me down a short hallway toward what I assumed was the back room.
"Here,"
he said, pointing into the room. I stepped into the doorway and froze. The room was empty. There was no furniture at all, and most importantly, the TV stand wasn't there. That's when I heard the door click shut behind me. I spun around to see him standing there, his hand on the doorknob. He was grinning now, but there was nothing friendly about it. "Where's the stand?" I asked, trying to pretend it was just a misunderstanding. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a step closer to me and away from the door.
"Relax,"
he said.
"I just wanted to talk."
I didn't wait to find out what he meant. Without thinking, I shoved past him as hard as I could and bolted down the hallway. He shouted something, but I didn't stop to listen. I sprinted out the front door, jumped into my car, and locked the doors. As I started the engine, I saw him come out onto the porch, glaring at me. I started my car and got out of there. I didn't stop driving until I was back in my apartment's parking lot. I was shaking as I sat in my car, replaying everything in my head. I texted a friend about what happened, and they convinced me to call the police. I gave them the address and explained what had happened. A couple of days later, I got a call from an officer. They had gone to the house and found out the man had a police record. He had a history of assault and other crimes. They didn't tell me much else, and I don't think he was charged for what happened that night. After that, I stopped using Craigslist for a while. I deleted the app from my phone and stuck to buying things new, even if it meant spending a little more. When I was still in high school, I finally managed to get my first job. I was a busboy at a decent restaurant in my town. I was 17 by then, and most of my friends were older, so they all had jobs, and most of them had cars. The pay was minimum wage, plus a small share of the tips that added up to around $10 per night. Even though the money was bad, I was still living with my parents, so I got to keep pretty much all of it. That's why I managed to save up a decent amount. After my first few months, I had enough to get a PS5, which is something that I really wanted. At that time, they were still hard to find in stores. I was mostly keeping an eye on the used market, but when they did pop up, they were overpriced. I spent weeks searching online, until I finally came across a Craigslist ad. The listing seemed pretty good. It was an almost new console for just $450. The seller claimed he'd used it only a few times, and was selling it to cover unexpected expenses. He sounded legit in his messages, and after a short back and forth, we agreed to meet. He picked a mall parking lot about 15 minutes from my house. The timing was a little weird. He wanted to meet at 10 p.m. I was a little uncomfortable with that, but he explained that he had work during the day and couldn't meet earlier. I thought about backing out, but I really wanted it, and the mall wasn't far from my friend Brian's place. I decided I'd swing by his apartment afterwards, so I texted him about my plan, and he said it was fine. Brian had his own apartment in a building right across from the mall, so it was perfect. When the time came, I told my parents where I was going, and that I'd be back late. They gave me a lot of freedom at that age, so it was no problem. I got into my car and made the short drive to the mall. By the time I arrived, the mall was mostly closed, and many of the lights were off. The place was nearly deserted. There were a few cars scattered about, but the lot felt much bigger and emptier than it ever did during the day. I did a few laps around the blacktop, but I wasn't sure which one was him. I pulled over to check my messages, and there was one from the seller. He let me know the make and color of his car. It was a gray Honda Civic. Right then, I spotted what looked like it, parked under a street lamp near the edge of the lot. I pulled into the space next to him and shut off my engine. For a few seconds, neither of us moved. Then the front door of his car opened, and a man stepped out. He looked older than I'd expected, maybe in his late 40s or early 50s. The next thing I noticed was that he had his right arm in a sling. It wasn't a proper cast or anything, just a piece of cloth tied around his shoulder. I got out and walked over to him.
Hey, you here for the PS5?
He asked, walking toward me. His voice was casual, but something about him put me on edge. He was a big guy who towered over me. He had a friendly face, but the sheer size of this man was intimidating, even though he didn't do anything to deserve the judgment. Yeah, I said. Do you have it with you?
Sure do,
He replied, motioning toward the back of his car.
It's in the back seat. You'll have to grab it yourself, though. My arm's messed up.
I followed him to his car, and he opened the back passenger door with his good arm. I looked in, and I could see a brown cardboard box sitting on the far side of the seat. It wasn't a PlayStation box like I would have expected. I stopped short. Can't you just hand it to me? He shook his head.
Wish I could, but with my arm like this, it's a pain.
The way he stood, half blocking the open door, made me uneasy. I looked at the box again, then back at him. Something wasn't right. I stepped back, shaking my head. Sorry, I'm not climbing into your car. If you can't hand it to me, I'm out. For a moment, the man just stared at me, his face unreadable. Then his expression shifted.
Come on, man. Don't be difficult,
He said, his tone growing sharper. I didn't respond. Instead, I turned and walked back towards my car. He called out after me, but I ignored him. As soon as I was inside, I locked the doors and started the engine. The man stood there for a second, then hurried back to his car. Then I pulled out of my parking spot. I had to do a loop around the lot to get out, and I passed the man's car again. I saw him through the windshield of his vehicle, and he had taken the sling off from his arm. Then he sped off in the opposite direction, before I could even think about getting his license plate number. On the drive to Brian's building, I kept replaying the scene in my head, even though I was there in less than 5 minutes. When I got to my friend's place, I told him what had happened. He didn't hesitate to make a judgment. That was definitely a setup, he said. The sling is definitely fake. The next day, I reported the guy to the police, but with only his email address, there wasn't much they could do. However, they said I'd done the right thing by leaving. Looking back, I'm glad I got out of there. I ended up getting a PS5 from someone else online, but that deal was legit. It was a little more expensive, but at least the seller didn't try to kidnap me or anything. I used to live in an apartment with a friend named Janice. We didn't know each other that well prior to moving in, but we had some friends in common. Long story short, it didn't work out very well. We would argue all the time, and eventually she asked me to move out. Since I wasn't on the lease, I didn't have much of a choice. I told her I'd move out as soon as I could find a new place. To her credit, she agreed to that and didn't try to get me kicked out right away. I spent the next few days crashing at a friend's house just to escape the awkwardness of it all. During that time, I was scouring online listings for a room I could afford. Most of the places I found were either too expensive or too far from work, but then I came across an ad on Craigslist. It was for a room in a house, and the rent was cheap. The description was vague, and the photos weren't great, but it was available immediately, and I was eager to find something. I emailed the person who posted the ad, and they responded within a few hours. The guy introduced himself as Jim and said I could come by the next evening to see the place. He gave me the address and told me to text him when I was on my way. The house was in a sketchy neighborhood, but I figured I'd at least take a look. After work that day, I went home to change, and luckily Janice wasn't there. I had something to eat and then got ready to go and see the room. When I arrived, most of the houses looked pretty crappy. They were mostly row houses, and many had boarded up windows. There were more than a few that seemed abandoned, and the whole neighborhood had that look. Jim's house was no exception. The paint on the wooden stairs was peeling. The front lawn was overgrown. The porch looked like it might collapse if you stepped on the wrong board. For a moment, I considered just driving away, but I had come all this way, so I decided to knock on the door. I walked up the shaky stairs and up to the front door. I pushed the doorbell, but I don't think it worked because I didn't hear anything. However, within a few seconds, the door swung open anyway. A man who looked older than I expected opened the door. He was probably in his mid-30s, with messy hair and a poorly fitting t-shirt.
You here for the room?
He asked. Yeah, I said timidly. Then Jim stepped aside and led me in. The inside of the house wasn't much better than the outside. The carpet was dingy, and there was a strange smell. Jim didn't seem to notice or care. He started talking as soon as I walked in, pointing out random details like the spacious living room and the functional kitchen, even though neither was remotely appealing. To be honest, he sounded like the world's worst real estate agent, but I knew he lived at the house. I let him show me around even though I knew right away that I wouldn't live there. The house was in bad shape, and Jim seemed off. He talked fast, barely giving me a chance to respond, and he kept fidgeting, like he was nervous. All in all, I would have rather stayed with Janice even with all of our problems. That wasn't possible anyway. I'm just saying that I wouldn't live with this guy, not even if the house was good. Still, I didn't want to be rude, so I followed him as he showed me the rest of the house. Eventually, he led me upstairs to what was supposed to be my room. It was small and had a bare mattress on the floor, but I assumed it was meant to be cleared out. There were no curtains on the window, and the smell was even worse up here. I wanted to leave, but before I could say anything, Jim moved to stand in the doorway. He put his arm on the door frame and leaned over. There was barely enough room to squeeze through if I wanted to, and I felt trapped.
What do you think?
He asked. I hesitated for a second, then said, I'll need to think about it. I'm sure he could read my tone, though. Jim didn't look happy with my answer.
You don't like it, do you?
He said, stepping closer.
You're wasting my time, aren't you?
I felt cornered and not sure of what to do next. I didn't want to make the situation worse, so I tried to keep my tone calm. I just need to think about it, I said again, backing up a step. Jim was still just a step from the doorway, and he stood there for a moment, staring at me like he was trying to decide what to do. Then he took a step towards me, and I knew I couldn't stay any longer. I quickly sidestepped him and managed to slip out of the room. Then I headed for the stairs. He didn't try to stop me, but I could feel his eyes on me as I made my way to the door. As soon as I was outside, I walked straight to my car. When I got in, I locked the doors and started the engine. Before I could pull away, I heard the front door slam shut behind me. I looked up, but there was nobody there. Jim was creepy and angry, but to his credit, he didn't chase me. Still, I knew I had made the right choice by leaving. The house was in terrible shape, and Jim's behavior had been weird. When I got home, I had no choice but to keep looking for another place. Luckily, I ended up moving in with a really great roommate named Andy. He was a PhD student with a wife and kids, and just stayed at the apartment that we shared for a few nights per week. It was almost like having my own place. Believe it or not, I actually found him on Craigslist as well. After my marriage ended about 2 years ago, I was in a panic to find a job. I had put my career on hold for a few years at that point, and my resume was way out of date. I did have a college degree, but little experience in my field. The last job I had didn't end well either, so any hope of a good reference was off the table. My savings were running low, and I still had some student loans that were gathering interest. I spent most days scrolling through job boards and sending out applications. I was hoping for a callback, but those were rare. Then finally, I found something on Craigslist that seemed like a good opportunity. The position was for an office assistant at a small startup, and the qualifications were reasonable. More often than not, entry-level positions ask for 3 to 5 years of experience, but this one didn't ask for any. They offered flexible hours and decent pay, which is uncommon these days. I emailed the contact listed and was surprised at how quickly they responded. They asked for a little more information about my background, and after I sent my answers, they invited me for an in-person interview. The catch was that it had to be at 8 p.m. because their days were packed with meetings. I thought the timing was odd, but the reasoning made sense, so I agreed. The night before the interview, I researched the company as much as I could, but there was just a Facebook profile and a basic website. The website was just some cookie-cutter page with stock images. I couldn't find anything about the employees or management, but I didn't worry. It was a startup after all. The address was for a strip mall in an industrial area of my city. I had been through there, and I knew there were a few factories and an abandoned warehouse somewhere close by. When I arrived, I was taken aback by how run down the area was. It was much worse than I remembered. Most of the stores in the mall were either closed or empty, and a few of the storefronts had graffiti sprayed across the windows. The office building next door was dim, with only a few lights on, and it didn't look like much. I parked near the entrance and stared at the structure for a minute. I was trying to reassure myself that this was normal. I reminded myself that startups often work out of modest spaces, since there isn't a lot of money to throw around. I went inside and took the stairs to the second floor, where a single office had its light on. The hallway smelled musty, and a bare bulb flickered on the ceiling. The door to an office was slightly open, and I decided to knock. "Come in," a man's voice called as I stood by the door. I stepped inside and saw a man who looked to be in his 40s. He had a warm smile and shook my hand, then introduced himself as Joel. The room could barely be considered an office. It had only a folding table, 2 chairs, and a laptop that wasn't even on. The vibe felt strange, like they had just set it up in 5 minutes that day. It sure didn't look like a team of people had been working there. But then he apologized for the temporary setup and motioned for me to sit. The interview started normally enough. He asked about my past jobs, my strengths, weaknesses, and why I wanted to work there. I did my best to sound confident, despite the nerves gnawing at me. As the questions continued, they started shifting away from work-related topics.
"Where do you live?"
he asked. I told him the name of my neighborhood, but nothing too specific. He nodded and smiled.
"It's nice out there, isn't it?"
Then he asked if I was single, which felt wildly inappropriate. I gasped and tried to laugh it off. "I don't see how that's relevant," I said, but he pretended like it was no big deal.
"Just making conversation,"
he replied arrogantly, like I was the weird one. His questions kept getting stranger, though.
"Do you have family nearby?"
he asked, leaning forward slightly.
"Anyone you're close with?"
I answered as vaguely as possible and glanced at the door, wondering how quickly I could leave without being rude. The interview was going downhill, but I didn't want to make a scene. After about 20 minutes, he stood up suddenly.
"There's just one last thing you need to do before we can move forward," he said, walking to the door.
He reached out and locked it with a firm click. I froze for a second, but I forced myself not to panic. "Actually," I said, grabbing my bag, "I forgot my portfolio in the car. Let me run out and get it. It will only take a second." He paused, his hand still resting on the door handle. For a moment, I thought he wouldn't let me leave, but then he nodded.
"Sure, go ahead."
I walked to the door and flipped the deadbolt. As soon as I stepped into the hallway, I ran down the stairs and out to my car. I didn't look back, not even when I heard the office door open behind me. I jumped into my car, locked the doors, and drove off. When I got home, I finally calmed down. By then, I had decided to report what happened. I searched for the company name and address online again, but this time, nothing came up. There was no website, and they were gone from Facebook. I reported the incident to the police the next day, but I wasn't able to tell them much. As for the office building, I found out from the police that the entire second floor was unoccupied at the time. They'd had some reports of trespassing there, and it is likely that the person I met was one of them. He probably didn't even have a company at all. I spent weeks wondering what might have happened if I hadn't trusted my gut and gotten out of there. Even now, I think about that night and how close I came to something far worse than a bad interview. When I was 22, I moved into my first apartment away from my mom. I'm a guy, but my name is Marion. I know it's a girl's name most of the time, but a lot of guys have it too. It was a small one-bedroom in a rundown building. It was pretty far away from my parents while being in the same city, and it was a large commute to work too. I didn't choose the location because it made sense. It really was all that I could afford. At the time, I was working part-time at a grocery store while trying to save up for college, so money was tight. I didn't have much furniture, just a mattress on the floor and a folding chair I'd found at a thrift store. I wanted to make the place feel a little more like home, so I turned to Craigslist to find cheap furniture. Over the course of a couple of weeks, I picked up a coffee table, a small dining set, and a used dresser, all for under $50 total. Most of the sellers were fine. They were polite, regular people who just wanted to get rid of their stuff. A few were a little odd, but nothing that seemed over the top. I got into the habit of scrolling through the listings every evening, looking for deals. One night, I came across an ad for a blender. It was an older model, but it was listed for only $15. The post was short, just a blurry picture and a sentence that said, "Blender for sale, text if interested." The address was only about 15 minutes from my apartment, so I sent a text. The seller responded quickly and said I could pick it up that night. The address was in a quiet residential area with mostly older houses. When I pulled up, the place looked normal. It was a small, single-story home. There were no cars in the driveway, and the porch light was off. I parked on the street and double-checked the address before getting out. Eventually, I opened my car door and walked up to the porch. I knocked on the front door, but there was no answer. After a moment, I knocked again. The door opened slightly, and I caught a glimpse of someone standing in the shadows. All the lights were off. A man's voice called out that the blender was in the back shed, and that I should head around to the side of the house. That seemed really weird to me. Every other Craigslist transaction I'd done had been straightforward. People usually brought the item to the door, and I didn't know why he was making it more complicated than that. I figured some people just didn't like having strangers in their house, though, so I went along with it. I walked around to the side of the house and found a narrow path leading to the backyard. The shed was visible from the driveway. It was a small structure with dented metal siding and a crooked roof. The yard itself was messy, with overgrown weeds and a rusted lawnmower lying in the grass. As I approached the shed, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. I hesitated for a moment before pushing it open. The inside was dark, but there was just enough light from the nearby streetlights to see the blender on a shelf on the back wall. It looked like the one in the ad, so I stepped inside and grabbed it. The shed smelled damp, and I realized it probably hadn't been used much recently. I was about to turn and leave when I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. They weren't loud, but in the quiet of the night, they were unmistakable. I turned quickly, expecting to see the seller, but there was no one there. My first thought was that I'd imagined it, but then I heard another sound, a low rustling, like someone was shifting in place. It was coming from the side of the shed, just out of view. I wasn't sure what to do, and I didn't have my phone on me. I'd left it in the car. Then the footsteps started again, this time moving away from the shed. I waited, listening until I couldn't hear them anymore. With the blender in hand, I walked back to the side of the house. Just then, I turned around and saw a man standing on the path behind me. I didn't know if he was the seller, because I didn't get a good look at him before. He didn't do anything really threatening, but he was being creepy by sneaking around like that. So I turned and went back to the front door to pay him the $15. But when I knocked this time, there was no answer. I tried another few times, but there was nothing. I'd had enough of this guy by that point, so I simply put the blender down and walked away. I got into my car and locked the doors immediately. As I drove off, I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw that same man standing on the porch. He wasn't waving or calling out. I drove straight home and spent the rest of the night replaying what had happened in my head. My best guess is that he was just a weird guy trying to scare me. He didn't try anything, and I only brought the $15 for the blender, so a robbery doesn't make much sense. I chalked this one up to a strange guy with too much time on his hands, but who knows, maybe he would have done something if I didn't get out of there when I did.